Get ready to dive into a story that defies reason and reveals the darkest side of human nature. Before we begin, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from right now. This story needs to be told, and you're a part of it. Autumn of 1884. The Appalachian Mountains stretch like an ancient spine along the east coast of the United States, holding secrets in every valley, in every stream that winds between moss-covered rocks. At that time, the region was still a land where civilization retreated before the vast wilderness, where entire communities could spend months without contact with the outside world, where a man's word carried more weight than any official document. It was a different America. The country was still healing from the Civil War that had ended less than 20 years earlier. In the southern Appalachian Mountains, especially in the regions that cut through West Virginia and eastern Tennessee, life followed its own rhythm, dictated by the seasons and the need for survival. There, hunting wasn't sport, it was sustenance. Families depended on venison, bear, and wild boar to get them through the harsh winters that turned trails into death traps of ice and snow. It was against this backdrop that 21 men gathered in a small wooden tavern on the banks of what the locals called Appalachian Creek, a stream that rose high in the Blue Ridge Mountains and wound its way through miles of dense forest to meet the Holston River in Tennessee. The establishment was owned by a man named Edgar Whitmore, a Civil War veteran who had lost his left leg at Shiloh and had returned home determined to turn the property he had inherited from his father into a gathering place for travelers and hunters. That September evening, the tavern was more crowded than usual. Men from different counties had responded to a peculiar invitation that had been circulating by word of mouth throughout the mountain communities all summer. Someone had proposed a 3-week hunting expedition, following the Appalachian Creek from its source to the point where it disappeared into nearly impassable swamps near the North Carolina border. The promise was simple and enticing. This region had never been explored by organized hunting parties, and reports spoke of an impressive abundance of game. The expedition's organizer was a man in his 40s named Samuel Brennan, known across 3 counties as an experienced guide and skilled tracker. Brennan had a solid reputation, built over 15 years of leading groups through difficult territory without ever losing a single man. He spoke little, but when he did, everyone listened. That night, as the fire crackled in the tavern's stone hearth and the smell of tobacco and corn whiskey filled the air, Brennan laid out his plan. The expedition would depart in 2 days. Each man was to bring his own weapons, enough ammunition for 3 weeks, blankets, an extra change of clothes, and basic provisions. Brennan assured him he knew of freshwater sources along the entire route, and that game would be so plentiful that they wouldn't need to carry much food. The group would camp in different locations every 2 or 3 nights, always close to the stream, using it as a reference point to avoid getting lost. The route was mapped out. They would climb to the source in the first 4 days, then slowly descend, exploring the side valleys where the animals usually took refuge. 20 men immediately agreed. They came from different places, but they shared the same need. Some were farmers needing meat for the winter. Others were young men seeking adventure and stories to tell. There were also some war veterans like Brennan, men who had never fully readjusted to domestic life and found in the mountains a way to escape the memories that haunted them. Among the 21 was a 32-year-old physician named Jonathan Hartley, who kept a detailed diary of his experiences. Hartley came from the north, from a wealthy Pennsylvania family, but chose to practice medicine in the rural communities of Appalachia, where few doctors ventured. He saw the expedition as an opportunity to study the region's medicinal flora and perhaps document previously uncatalogued species. Months later, his diary would be one of the few clues to what really happened during those 3 weeks. Then there were the Cunningham brothers, 3 rugged men of Scottish descent who worked as lumberjacks in Washington County, Virginia. They knew the mountains like few others, having grown up hunting and trapping since childhood. If anyone had a chance of surviving any unforeseen event, it was them, or so everyone thought. The group also included a black man named Moses Freeman, a former freed slave who worked as a blacksmith and was known as an exceptional marksman. In a time and place where racial tensions still simmered just below the surface, Moses' presence on the expedition spoke volumes about the respect he had earned in the community. Brennan had personally invited him, and no one dared question it. The group included merchants, farmers, a carpenter, a former Confederate soldier who rarely spoke of the war, and even a Methodist preacher named Reverend Amos Pike, who saw the journey as a way to bring the divine word to the unexplored reaches of creation. Pike was a thin man with deep-set eyes and a deep voice, carrying a battered Bible in one pocket and a Springfield rifle in the other. On the morning of September 23rd, 1884, the 21 men gathered again at Whitmore's Tavern. The sun was just beginning to gild the mountaintops when they set out, forming a ragged line that was soon swallowed up by the dense forest. Whitmore stood in the doorway of his tavern, watching until the last man disappeared into the trees. He waved, but no one looked back. The first 2 weeks passed without major incident, according to surviving fragments of Hartley's journal. The group followed Appalachian Creek as planned, finding abundant game and fresh water. The men established a routine. They rose at dawn, hunted during the day in smaller groups of 3 or 4, and gathered at dusk to prepare meals and share stories around the fire. Hartley recorded everything with the precision of a scientist. He described the plants he encountered, the types of trees that dominated each altitude, the temperature variations between the deep valleys and the exposed peaks. His notes reveal a man fascinated by the complexity of that ecosystem, but also someone attentive to the human details of the expedition. He mentioned the nocturnal conversations, the jokes that passed between the hunters, the small disagreements that arose and dissolved just as quickly. In an entry dated October 5th, Hartley wrote about the discovery of ancient structures near a smaller tributary of the creek. They were the remains of rotting wooden cabins, almost completely consumed by time and vegetation. Brennan examined the ruins and concluded that they likely belonged to an ancient Cherokee hunting camp, abandoned decades earlier when the tribes were forced to migrate west during what history would record as the Trail of Tears. The discovery brought a respectful silence to the group. Even rugged men like the Cunningham brothers seemed to understand that they were treading on land marked by previous tragedies. But there was something more to those ruins. Moses Freeman noticed marks on some nearby trees, deep carvings that formed symbols no one could decipher. They didn't look like Cherokee script, nor the conventional signs hunters used to mark trails. They were different, disturbing in some way no one could explain. Reverend Pike suggested they were warnings, perhaps territorial markings made by hostile groups. Brennan dismissed the concern with a wave of his hand, saying the marks were decades old and posed no danger. That night, for the first time, the group was unable to build a proper fire. The wood was unusually damp despite the absence of rain in days. After several failed attempts, they managed to maintain only a small fire, enough to warm their food but insufficient to completely ward off the chill that descended from the mountains as night fell. The men slept closer together that night, wrapped in blankets that smelled of smoke and sweat. Hartley noted something curious in his diary. During the night, several men reported hearing strange sounds coming from the forest. They weren't the sounds of familiar animals, not owls or wolves. They were something between a whistle and a moan, too distant to pinpoint, too close to ignore. When the sun rose, no one mentioned the sounds. It was as if there had been a tacit agreement not to talk about it, not to give substance to the discomfort everyone felt. The expedition continued. On the 16th day, they reached a point where the Appalachian Creek split into 3 smaller branches, each flowing through a different valley. Brennan gathered the group and proposed a temporary division. He would lead a group of 7 men down the central branch, which seemed more promising for hunting. The Cunningham brothers would lead another group of 7 down the west branch, and Moses Freeman would lead the remaining 7 down the east branch. They would meet again in 3 days, at a specific point downriver marked by a distinctive rock formation that Brennan described in detail. Hartley remained with Brennan's group. His last journal entry from that phase of the expedition mentions a sense of unease. He wrote that the proposed split seemed rushed, that Brennan didn't offer solid reasons for separating a group that had been functioning well together, but no one questioned it. Brennan's authority was unquestionable, built on years of experience and previous successes. The 3 groups separated at noon on October 10th. The sky was heavy with low clouds that seemed to portend rain. The air had that heavy, muggy quality that precedes mountain storms. Each group disappeared in its own direction, quickly swallowed up by the density of the autumn forest, where the leaves were beginning to turn red and gold. For 2 days, Brennan's group followed the central branch of the creek. Hunting proved disappointing. They saw fresh deer tracks, but the animals seemed nervous, impossible to approach. It was as if something had disturbed them, sending an invisible warning through the forest. On the second night, while camping in a small clearing, one of the men in the group, a farmer named Thomas Webb, disappeared. Webb had gone out to gather firewood. The camp was less than 50 yards away. He brought an axe and promised to return in a few minutes. An hour passed. Then 2. Brennan organized an immediate search. They shouted Webb's name until they were hoarse, searched the area in ever-widening circles, and lit makeshift torches to continue searching as night fell. They found nothing. No tracks, no signs of a struggle, not even the axe. It was as if Thomas Webb had simply been erased from existence. Hartley wrote in his diary that it made no sense, that a grown man doesn't disappear without leaving a trace 50 yards away from 6 other people, but that's exactly what happened. The next morning, Brennan made a decision. They would abandon the search for Webb and head immediately to the rendezvous point with the other groups. Perhaps Webb had become disoriented and gone in the wrong direction. Perhaps he would encounter one of the other groups. It was a fragile hope, but the only one they had. Remaining there, Brennan explained, would risk someone else getting lost. Brennan's group, now reduced to 6 men, marched throughout the next day. They reached the rendezvous point at dusk on October 12th. The rock formation was unmistakable, 3 enormous boulders stacked in a seemingly impossible fashion, creating a sort of natural arch. There, they waited. The other groups did not show up. Brennan kept everyone awake all night, stoking a large fire as a signal. They fired shots into the air at regular intervals, the sound echoing through the valleys like distant thunder. Nothing. Only the oppressive silence of the forest answered. As the sun rose on October 13th, Brennan finally admitted what everyone already knew. Something was terribly wrong. They had 2 options. They could try to find the other groups, which meant turning back and searching 3 different valleys with no guarantee of success, or they could continue downriver until they reached known territory and sought help. Hartley argued for the former. He was a medic. He felt a responsibility for the other men, but the others voted to press on. Fear had settled in this small group of 6, a visceral fear that none of them could fully name. They began their descent. For 3 days, they followed the Appalachian Creek toward civilization. The journey was a nightmare of natural obstacles, treacherous terrain, and a growing sense of being watched. Hartley stopped writing in his journal after the second night of this descent. The last entries are fragmented, almost incoherent, mentioning shadows among the trees, sounds that followed the group, the certainty that something was following them. On the 18th day since the expedition began, Brennan's group lost another man. This time it happened in broad daylight. They were walking single file along a narrow trail that skirted a cliff. The man who disappeared was a carpenter named Henry Dalton, who was 4th in line. One moment he was there, his footsteps audible on the dry leaves, his breathing heavy from the exertion of the walk. The next, the man behind him realized that Henry was simply gone. The group stopped immediately. They hurried back the way they had just come. They searched below the cliff, fearing Henry had slipped and fallen. Nothing. The chasm dropped more than 100 feet into a rocky valley, but there was no body, no sign of a recent fall. The rocks below were covered in ancient, untouched moss. It was impossible for someone to have fallen there without leaving a mark. Brennan gathered the remaining 5 men. For the first time since the expedition began, his confidence seemed shaken. Hartley noticed the guide's hands tremble slightly as he reloaded his rifle. They resolved not to stop until they reached some human habitation, no matter how long it took. They would walk through the night if necessary, taking turns keeping watch, but they would not camp in that forest again. All afternoon and night, the 5 men marched as if fleeing from something invisible. They barely spoke, conserving energy for the brutal trek. When darkness fell and it became impossible to continue without risking fatal accidents, they tied themselves together with ropes, forming a human chain, and took turns leaning against a clump of trees to rest. It was during that night that they heard the voices. These weren't the strange sounds they'd heard before. They were distinct human voices, calling names. Hartley recognized the voice of Thomas Webb, the first man to disappear. He was calling out his name, begging for help, saying he was injured and couldn't find his way back. The voice came from somewhere in the darkness to their left, perhaps 50 or 60 yards away. One of the men, a former Confederate soldier named James Porter, began to pull away from his ropes, determined to follow the voice and rescue Webb. Brennan held him tightly, pressing him against the tree trunk. In a harsh, desperate whisper, Brennan explained that this wasn't Webb, it couldn't be. Webb had been missing for 6 days, and the voice they heard sounded perfectly healthy, with no sign of injury or exhaustion. It was a trap, something trying to separate them. Porter struggled against Brennan, his voice breaking with sobs as he repeated that he couldn't abandon a comrade. The other men had to help restrain him, keeping him tied up and silencing his screams with their hands. Meanwhile, other voices began to join the first. They heard Henry Dalton calling. They heard voices that seemed to belong to the Cunningham brothers and Moses Freeman. All came from different directions. All begged for help. All sounded frighteningly real. Brennan ordered everyone to close their eyes and cover their ears. They spent the rest of the night like that, tied together, trying to block out the sounds coming from the forest. Hartley would later describe that night as the longest of his life, each minute dragging on like an eternity, as the voices continued to call, sometimes pleading, sometimes angry, sometimes weeping in a way that broke his heart. When the sun finally rose, the voices abruptly ceased. The 5 men released themselves from their ropes and continued their desperate march. They did not speak of what they had experienced. There were no adequate words, no explanation that made sense. They simply moved on, staggering with exhaustion, hunger, and terror. It was on the 19th day that they encountered the first sign of civilization. A rudimentary wooden fence, clearly built by human hands, marked the boundary of a property. They followed it like castaways following the shore after days adrift. The fence led them to a small, isolated farmhouse, a simple log building with an attached barn and a few animals grazing. The farm owner was a middle-aged man named Augustus Cole, who lived there with his wife and worked a plot of land his family had farmed for 3 generations. When Cole saw the 5 men emerging from the forest, he almost didn't recognize them as human. They were covered in dirt, their clothes torn, their faces scarred with scratches and their eyes sunken as if they hadn't slept properly in days. They looked like specters, ghosts the mountain had decided to return. Cole welcomed them with the hospitality characteristic of those remote regions where refusing shelter to a traveler was considered a grave sin. His wife, Martha, prepared hot food and provided water for them to wash. The 5 men ate in silence, as if they had forgotten the basic manners of social interaction. Only after satisfying their most pressing hunger was Brennan able to articulate what had happened. Cole listened, his expression growing grim. When Brennan finished reporting the disappearance of the other hunters, Cole nodded slowly and exchanged a meaningful look with his wife. He'd known the region all his life, he explained, and there were old stories about the Appalachian Creek, especially its upper tributaries. The Cherokee who lived there before the forced removal had specific names for those valleys, names that translated to mean something like, where men are lost or trail of no return. Later, settlers learned to avoid certain areas. There were documented, though rare, instances of trappers and explorers entering these valleys and never returning. Cole mentioned a group of surveyors who disappeared in 1867, hired by the government to map the region. They set out in July of that year, a team of 9 well-equipped and experienced men. Only one returned 3 months later, found wandering near a settlement in Tennessee. The man was delirious, unable to coherently explain what had happened to his companions. He repeated nonsensical phrases about shadows that walked like men and voices that imitated the dead. Cole recommended they seek out authorities in the nearest county, a 2-day ride away. He offered to lend them horses and was willing to accompany them personally. The next morning, the 6 men set off from the ranch for the county seat of Sullivan County, Tennessee. It took them 2 days to reach the ranch, stopping only long enough to rest the animals. The Sullivan County sheriff was a pragmatic man named Walter Briggs, who had held the position for 12 years and had a reputation for fairness but skepticism when it came to extraordinary stories. When Brennan and his companions reported the disappearance of 14 men in the mountains, Briggs listened attentively but maintained a neutral expression that betrayed neither belief nor doubt. Briggs immediately organized a rescue expedition. He gathered 20 men, including experienced trackers, a local doctor and even a federal government representative who happened to be in the area dealing with land disputes. The expedition would depart at dawn the next day, October 23rd, exactly 1 month after the original group had left Whitmore's tavern. Brennan insisted on accompanying the rescue expedition despite his evident exhaustion. Hartley also volunteered, arguing that his medical expertise could be crucial if they found wounded survivors. The other 3 men in the original group, however, flatly refused. James Porter, the former Confederate soldier, declared that he would rather face all the horrors of war again than return to those woods. The other 2 silently agreed, their faces pale at the mere thought of returning. The rescue expedition set out under a grey sky that threatened rain. There were 22 men in all, well armed and carrying a week's worth of provisions. Sheriff Briggs established strict rules. No one would stray more than 50 yards from the main group. They would conduct regular head counts to ensure everyone was present, and at the slightest sign of danger, they would return immediately. He treated the mission with military seriousness, aware that he was risking more lives in an attempt to find men who were likely already dead. Augustus Cole served as guide to the end of his property, showing Brennan the most direct route back to Appalachian Creek. Before parting, Cole pulled Sheriff Briggs aside and had a private conversation that lasted several minutes. Hartley, observing closely, noticed that Briggs emerged visibly upset, adjusting his rifle to his shoulder with more force than necessary. It took them 3 days to reach the spot where Brennan and his 5 companions had encountered the distinctive rock formation. The journey was arduous but uneventful. The group maintained exemplary discipline. No one strayed, and regular counts confirmed that all 22 men remained together. When they reached the 3 stacked rocks forming the natural arch, it was late afternoon on October 26th. There they found the first disturbing piece of evidence. In the exact spot where Brennan and his group had camped and waited for the others, there were clear signs that someone had been there recently. Ashes from a fire that couldn't have been more than a few days old, considering the rains that had fallen in the area. Marks on the ground indicating where people had slept. And something even more disturbing, arrangements of small stones forming circular patterns, as if someone had tried to create some kind of symbol or marking. One of the expedition's trackers, a Cherokee man named Thomas Whitehawk, who occasionally worked for the sheriff, examined the stone arrangements for several minutes. He spoke quietly to Briggs, pointing out specific details in the patterns. When Briggs asked if they held any tribal significance, Whitehawk shook his head. These symbols didn't belong to any Cherokee tradition he knew. They were something different, something older perhaps, or simply the work of troubled minds trying to bring order to chaos. Briggs decided to establish a base camp there. It was a strategic vantage point from which they could methodically explore the 3 branches of the creek. They set up tents, organized watch shifts, and lit several campfires to provide good lighting for the perimeter. The sheriff made it clear that no one would sleep without at least 4 men awake and alert. The next morning, they divided into 3 exploration parties, but unlike the original expedition, each group had only 6 or 7 men and would spend only 1 day exploring before returning to base camp. Brennan would lead the search for the central arm, where his group had lost Thomas Webb. Whitehawk would lead the exploration of the west arm, the territory originally assigned to the Cunningham brothers. Briggs himself would lead the search for the east arm, where Moses Freeman was supposed to have led his group. Brennan's group set out at dawn. They followed the central branch of the stream, retracing the steps Brennan knew by painful memory. It took most of the day to reach the clearing where Thomas Webb had disappeared. The place looked different in the daylight, with more men present, less threatening, but no less mysterious. They searched the area systematically, expanding their search in concentric circles from the center of the old campfire. They found Webb's axe. It was partially buried under fallen leaves, less than 20 meters from the campsite. The blade had dark stains that could have been old blood or simply rust from the damp. There were no other signs of Webb, no torn clothing, no evidence of a struggle or violence. Brennan held the axe with trembling hands. Hartley saw tears well up in the experienced guide's eyes, the first sign of emotion he'd shown since the nightmare began. Brennan whispered something about having failed his men, about not having grasped the danger in time. One of the rescuers, a local farmer named Robert Marsh, put his hand on Brennan's shoulder and said that no man could have foreseen what had happened. They returned to base camp before dark, as planned. Whitehawk's group was already there, having returned an hour earlier. They had found nothing in the west arm, no sign of the Cunningham brothers or the men under their command. It was as if that group of 7 had simply never existed, swallowed up completely by the forest without a trace. Sheriff Briggs's group arrived last, just before total darkness. They brought news. They had found evidence of a camp on the east arm, approximately a 3-hour hike from the rendezvous point. The camp was abandoned, but appeared to have been left in a hurry. There were scattered blankets, some discarded supplies, and something more disturbing, bloodstains on several stones surrounding the old campfire. Whitehawk had collected blood samples, wrapped in clean cloth. There was no way to determine for sure whether it was human or animal blood without proper equipment, but the quantity and distribution suggested something violent. The marks formed a spatter pattern, as if someone had been injured and moved quickly through the camp while bleeding. Even more disturbing were the marks on the trees surrounding the camp. They were deep carvings, apparently made with knives or axes, forming fragmented words. Briggs had copied some into his notebook. The words were desperate and disjointed. "They're not real. Don't listen. Stay together." And a complete sentence he read aloud to the assembled group. "They imitate the dead." A heavy silence fell over the camp. Everyone there knew Brennan's accounts of the voices in the forest, how they seemed to perfectly imitate missing men. Seeing those words carved into trees by desperate hands made it all terribly real. These weren't the hallucinations of exhausted men. Others had experienced the same phenomenon, had tried to leave warnings for those who came after. Briggs proposed returning to the camp they had found on the East Branch the next morning, this time with the entire group. Moving all 22 men there would be risky, but he wanted to investigate further, to look for more evidence or clues about the fate of Moses Freeman's group. Perhaps they would find survivors, perhaps just more unanswered questions. That night, the camp remained on high alert. 8 men kept constant watch, rotating every 2 hours. The fires were fed generously, creating a circle of light that kept the darkness of the forest at bay. Around midnight, the lookouts began reporting sounds coming from the forest. They weren't the normal noises of nocturnal animals. They were footsteps, distinct and heavy, as if several people were walking in circles around the perimeter lit by the fires. The footsteps maintained a constant distance, never getting close enough to reveal their origin, but too close to ignore. Briggs ordered no one to respond or react to the sounds. Everyone was to remain within the circle of light, weapons ready but not firing unless something actually attacked. It was a remarkable display of discipline. Nervous armed men, hearing what seemed like an invisible threat circling their position, maintained their composure and followed orders. The steps continued for approximately 2 hours. Then they abruptly ceased, replaced by an even more unsettling silence. It was as if the entire forest had stopped breathing. No crickets, no owls, no whisper of wind in the leaves, just a sonic void that pressed against the eardrums like deep water. Hartley would later note that the silence was worse than any sound. It was unnatural, wrong in a way that defied rational explanation. He felt like screaming just to break the oppressive stillness, but he restrained himself, watching the other men around the fire with equally distraught expressions. The silence lasted perhaps 20 minutes, though it felt much longer. When it was finally broken, it was by the normal sounds of the forest gradually returning. First a distant cricket, then another, then an owl calling, and eventually the full murmur of nightlife resuming its natural course. It was as if something had passed, a suffocating presence that now withdrew, allowing the world to return to normal. No one slept much that night. When dawn finally arrived, it was met with palpable relief. Briggs gathered everyone together and checked the count. 22 men all present. He announced the day's plan. They would travel together to the abandoned camp on the East Arm, investigate thoroughly, and then decide on their next steps. The hike took a little over 3 hours. The terrain was uneven. The stream had to be crossed at several points, and the large group necessarily moved slowly to keep everyone together. When they reached the spot Briggs described, sunlight filtering through the treetops illuminated a scene that would remain etched in the memory of every man present. The camp was exactly as Briggs had described. Blankets scattered, supplies abandoned, dark stains on the rocks. But there was something else that only became apparent with better lighting and more time to examine. On the surrounding trees, besides the carved words Briggs had copied, there were dozens of other markings. Some were simple vertical lines, as if someone were counting days. Others were more complex symbols, desperate attempts to communicate something. Whitehawk spent a long time studying the markings. He identified different carving styles, suggesting that multiple people had made the marks at different times. Some were deep and deliberate, made with time and care. Others were shallow and hurried, desperate scratches in the bark. One in particular caught his eye, a sequence of 7 vertical lines, then a horizontal line crossing them, then 3 more vertical lines. There were 10 marks, 10 days. Someone had remained in that camp for at least 10 days, counting time. This meant that at least one member of Moses Freeman's group had survived for more than a week after the initial separation. The question no one wanted to voice was, where was that person now? Hartley examined the bloodstains more closely. As a physician, he had some experience interpreting wounds. The distribution of the blood suggested a significant wound, likely to a limb, with the victim moving quickly through the camp. It wasn't an amount that would indicate immediate death, but it was certainly enough to severely weaken someone, especially without proper treatment. Briggs ordered a systematic search of the area around the camp. They spread out in a coordinated pattern, maintaining visual contact with each other, searching every bush, every depression in the ground, every possible hiding place. The search took the rest of the morning and part of the afternoon. They found more disturbing evidence. About 50 yards north of the camp, they discovered torn clothing hanging from low-hanging branches, as if someone had hurriedly ripped it off. The clothes were stained with dried blood and mud, but there was no body nearby. A little further on, they found a leather satchel containing a few personal belongings. A pocket watch stopped at 3:17, a folded letter addressed to a woman in Richmond, Virginia, and a small daguerreotype portrait of a family. Brennan recognized the portrait immediately. It was Moses Freeman, his wife, and their 2 oldest children. The image had been taken a few years earlier, likely shortly after emancipation, a considerable investment for a family of former slaves. Moses carried the image with pride, occasionally showing it to his companions during evenings around the campfire on the original expedition. Finding that abandoned portrait in the woods was like discovering a disembodied grave. Moses would never have left that image behind willingly. It was one of his most precious possessions, a tangible connection to his family, to his humanity, to everything that mattered to him. Briggs carefully wrapped the portrait and the letter in clean cloth, promising to return them to Moses's family upon their return. They continued searching until dusk. They found nothing more significant. No bodies, no graves, no further clues to the fate of the 7 men who must have camped there. It was as if, after those 10 days counted in the tree, everyone had simply dissolved into thin air. Briggs gathered the group to discuss their next move. The light was fading rapidly, and they had to decide whether to camp here or return to the meeting point of the 3 stacked stones. Most of the men voted to return. No one wanted to spend the night in this place, haunted by evidence of suffering and mystery. They began their return journey as the last rays of sunlight still touched the mountaintops to the west. The trek in the twilight was risky, but less frightening than remaining in that abandoned camp. They marched in tight formation, each man maintaining eye contact with at least 2 companions. It was during this return trek that something happened that would split the group and determine the fate of the rescue expedition. One of the men in the rear, a lumberjack named Patrick O'Brien, swore he saw someone among the trees. It wasn't a vague shadow or a trick of the light. It was a distinct human figure, standing behind a thick oak tree, watching the group pass. O'Brien shouted a warning and pointed in the direction of the figure. Half the group immediately turned, weapons raised, scanning the gloom between the trees. The other half held their position, protecting the line of march. Briggs ordered everyone to remain in place, while he and Whitehawk advanced cautiously toward the indicated oak. They found no one. The tree stood there, solid and ancient, but there was no human figure, no fresh tracks on the leaf-covered ground, no broken branches indicating recent movement. O'Brien insisted on what he had seen, his voice rising defensively. He described a tall man in dark clothing, standing completely still as if he were part of the forest itself. Briggs didn't accuse O'Brien of lying or imagining things. He simply ordered them to keep marching, with increased vigilance. But the seed of doubt had been planted. If someone really was watching them, who would it be? A survivor of the missing groups? Something more sinister? Or simply frayed nerves creating illusions? They reached the base camp of 3 stacked rocks when night had fallen completely. The fires they had lit that morning were out, as expected, but something else had changed. The tents they had carefully pitched were toppled over, not destroyed but simply fallen, as if someone had pulled out the stakes one by one. The supplies they had left organized were scattered throughout the camp. There were no signs of animals. A bear or a group of raccoons would have left distinctive marks, ripped open food bags or left footprints. It seemed deliberate, methodical, almost as if someone had scoured the campsite looking for something specific or simply trying to send a message. Briggs ordered an immediate defensive formation. The 22 men formed a tight circle, backs to back, guns pointed outward. He assigned 6 men to quickly relight the fires while the others stood guard. Within 15 minutes, they had light again, a secure perimeter, and were beginning to reorganize the camp. No one mentioned the obvious. They weren't alone in those woods. Something or someone knew exactly where they were, had entered their camp during the day, and clearly wasn't afraid of their presence. The question lingering in the chilly night air was whether that something was human or not. Hartley spoke at length with Briggs that night near the main fire. The doctor argued that they needed to consider rational explanations before giving in to panic. Perhaps there were survivors from the original groups who had lost their sanity, wandering the forest in a state of confusion. Perhaps there were isolated inhabitants of those mountains, hermits or fugitives who resented the presence of large groups in territory they considered their own. Briggs listened patiently, but his expression betrayed skepticism. He'd been sheriff long enough to develop instincts about danger, and every fiber of his being screamed that this situation was beyond conventional explanation. Still, he agreed with Hartley that they would maintain discipline and rationality. Panicking would be fatal. The night passed without obvious incident, though few men slept soundly. In the morning, Briggs announced his decision. They would search another day, concentrating their efforts on the west arm where the Cunningham brothers were supposed to have explored. If they found no concrete evidence or survivors by nightfall, they would abandon the search and return to civilization. He recognized that continuing beyond that point would be throwing good lives after bad. The entire group moved together toward the West Branch. There would be no more divisions, not after everything they had witnessed. The hike took all morning, following the winding course of the stream through increasingly rugged terrain. The mountains seemed to close in on them, the valleys narrowed, the vegetation denser. It was Whitehawk who found the first sign of the Cunningham brothers, a hunting knife with initials engraved on the handle, belonging to the eldest brother. The knife was embedded in a tree, approximately chest-high, buried up to the hilt in the wood. It had taken considerable force to drive the blade so deeply. The question was whether it had been driven in deliberately or in some kind of struggle. Around the tree with the knife they began to find more items. A hat here, a canteen there, an ammunition pouch farther on. It was like following a trail of breadcrumbs, except the breadcrumbs were belongings of missing men. The items formed a jagged line that led deeper into the valley, gradually moving away from the stream. Briggs hesitated. It seemed obviously a trap, an attempt to lure them away from the relative safety of the waterway. But at the same time, it was his only solid clue as to the Cunningham brothers' fate. He decided to follow the trail of items, but with extreme caution, keeping the group compact and establishing landmarks to ensure they could return. The trail took them nearly a mile through difficult terrain. They climbed rocky slopes, crossed small streams, and passed through dense woods where sunlight barely penetrated. And then, abruptly, they came to a clearing none of them expected. The clearing was circular, approximately 50 meters in diameter, surrounded by exceptionally old and tall trees. The ground was covered in a thick layer of moss that completely silenced footsteps. In the center of the clearing stood a structure. It wasn't natural. It was clearly constructed by human hands, though of strange design and obscure purpose. It consisted of upright trunks arranged in an inner circle, perhaps 10 or 12 saplings that had been debarked, polished, and driven deep into the ground. Between these trunks were intertwined smaller branches, forming complex, almost geometric patterns. Whitehawk approached the structure slowly, studying every detail. After a few minutes of silent examination, he turned to Briggs and shook his head. This wasn't Cherokee, not from any tribe he knew. The building was ancient, the logs showing years of exposure, but the design didn't correspond to any Native American tradition. Even more disturbing was what lay within the circle of logs. Objects were carefully arranged amidst the moss, rusted tools that looked decades old, fragments of rotting tissue, bones. Hartley entered the circular structure with the caution of a man treading on sacred or profane ground, still unsure which. He knelt next to the bones, examining them with a trained clinical eye. They were human, without a doubt. Multiple individuals, judging by the variety of sizes and stages of decomposition. Some bones were yellowed with age, clearly years or decades old. Others were more recent, still showing traces of dried tissue attached. The doctor counted at least 3 complete skulls among the scattered remains. He didn't touch anything, just observed and made mental notes. The bones weren't scattered randomly. There was an intentional, almost ceremonial arrangement. Skulls were positioned toward the center, long bones arranged in radial patterns. Someone had devoted considerable time and effort to creating this macabre display. Briggs ordered everyone to retreat from the structure. He assigned 4 men to make a detailed record of the scene, drawing maps and noting the exact positions of every visible item. The rest of the group established a defensive perimeter around the clearing, monitoring the tree line in all directions. It was during this process that one of the men on the perimeter, a farmer named Lucas Brennan, a distant cousin of the guide Samuel Brennan, noticed marks on the trees surrounding the clearing. They were deep notches, similar to those they had found at the abandoned camp, but these were much older. The bark had partially grown over them, indicating they were made years earlier, perhaps a decade or more. The markings didn't form English words. They were symbols, some vaguely recognizable as Roman numerals, others completely alien to any writing system the men present knew. Whitehawk studied the markings for a long time, his expression growing increasingly somber. When Briggs asked if he could interpret them, Whitehawk replied only that there was something wrong with the place, something his people had learned to avoid long before European settlers arrived. Samuel Brennan, who had remained silent since they entered the clearing, finally spoke. His voice was hoarse, thick with suppressed emotion. He said he recognized one of the fragments of fabric within the circular structure. It was part of a shirt that had belonged to Thomas Webb, the first man in their group to disappear. The red and black checkered pattern was distinctive. Brennan clearly remembered Webb wearing that shirt in the early days of the expedition. The implication was clear and dire. Webb hadn't simply gotten lost or had an accident. Somehow he had ended up here in this hidden clearing, and his remains were now part of a collection that included victims from years past. The discovery transformed the rescue mission into something darker, an investigation into multiple murders or disappearances that extended far beyond the original group of 21 hunters. Briggs made an executive decision. They needed to get out of those woods immediately and return with a much larger force, including representatives from the federal government. This was beyond the jurisdiction of a county sheriff. It was a case that required experienced investigators, adequate resources, and possibly military involvement. He ordered the men to gather whatever evidence they could carry easily, some of the most recent bones, identifiable tissue fragments, samples of the knife marks on the trees. Everything would be carefully wrapped and documented. Then they would abandon this damned place as quickly as possible. While the assigned men collected evidence, the rest of the group remained vigilant at the perimeter. The clearing was unbearably silent. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. It was the same unnatural silence they had experienced the night before, that complete absence of life that made every man present feel as if something fundamental was wrong with the very fabric of reality in that place. They were almost finished collecting evidence when they heard the sound. It came from beyond the tree line, opposite where they had entered the clearing. It was a whistle, long and modulated, definitely produced by human lips, but there was something off about the tonality, something that made the sound seem simultaneously close and distant, as if echoing from multiple directions. The whistle was answered by another, coming from a different point around the clearing, then another, and another. Within seconds, they were surrounded by a series of whistles coming from all directions, forming a ring of sound around the 22 men. Briggs shouted the order for a defensive formation. The men quickly formed up, their backs to the center, their guns pointed outward. Some wanted to shoot in the direction of the sounds, but the sheriff strictly forbade it. They couldn't see any targets. Wasting ammunition would be foolish, and besides, they weren't entirely sure they were being threatened. The whistling continued for perhaps 2 minutes. Then it ceased as abruptly as it had begun. The silence that followed was even more oppressive. The men waited, muscles tense, fingers on triggers, breaths held. Nothing happened. No attack came. No figure emerged from the forest. After 5 minutes that felt like hours, Briggs ordered a tactical retreat. They would move as a cohesive unit, maintaining formation, exiting the clearing by the same route they had used to enter. They would not run, as running in groups across uneven terrain would be disastrous, but they would walk as quickly as possible while maintaining cohesion. The retreat was tense but organized. They retraced their steps across the 2 kilometers of difficult terrain, each man maintaining visual contact with multiple companions, all vigilant for signs of ambush. The whistles didn't return, but the feeling of being watched never left them. It took nearly 3 hours to return to the point where they had left the west branch of the creek. When they finally reached the running water, several men dropped to their knees and drank greedily, as if the cold liquid could somehow wash away the terror they had experienced. Briggs allowed them a brief rest, just 15 minutes, before ordering them to continue toward base camp. The sun was beginning to set when they reached the 3 stacked rocks. The camp they had left that morning remained untouched this time. Small consolation, but consolation nonetheless. They quickly pitched their tents, built larger than necessary fires, and established watch shifts with 8 men awake simultaneously. Briggs gathered his informal officers, including Brennan, Hartley, Whitehawk, and some of the more experienced men. They discussed the situation quietly, away from the others to avoid spreading further panic. The consensus was unanimous. They needed to leave at dawn and not stop until they reached civilized territory. Hartley raised the issue of the missing men. Would they simply abandon the search? Briggs was blunt in his answer. They had no ability to find or rescue the missing. Worse, staying any longer only risked adding 22 names to the list of victims. The only responsible course of action was to withdraw, report to the appropriate authorities, and return with a larger, better-equipped expedition. The night that followed was the longest any man present would ever experience. Watch shifts alternated every 2 hours, but in practice no one slept soundly. Every sound in the forest was amplified by tension. Every shadow beyond the circle of firelight seemed to hold unseen threats. The men kept their weapons close, fingers never far from the triggers. Around 1 a.m., lookouts reported movement on the outskirts of the camp. It wasn't the heavy footsteps of the previous night, but something more subtle. Twigs occasionally snapping, the sound of something large moving through the dense vegetation, keeping its distance but clearly circling the camp. The pattern was consistent. Movement detected in one spot, then silence, then movement in another spot a few minutes later. Whitehawk suggested it might be a large cat, perhaps a cougar. These mountains still harbored healthy populations of predators that had learned to avoid humans, but occasionally showed curiosity about campsites. The explanation was plausible, even comforting. It allowed the men to attribute the sounds to something natural, understandable, part of the known world. But then the voices started again. This time, they were different from what Brennan and his group had experienced. They didn't mimic familiar men calling for help. Instead, they were fragments of conversation, as if multiple people were having casual discussions in the darkness surrounding the camp. The words were indistinct, impossible to fully understand, but the tone was unmistakably human. Occasional laughter, exclamations, the natural rhythm of people conversing comfortably. The effect was deeply unsettling. It suggested a sizable group of people nearby, moving through the nocturnal forest with ease, completely unconcerned by the presence of 22 armed men. Or worse, deliberately trying to communicate that they didn't fear these men, that the camped group was in territory they didn't control. Briggs ordered absolute silence in the camp. No one was to respond to voices. No one was to even whisper. They were to remain quiet, alert, waiting for dawn. It was an extraordinary display of discipline. Frightened men, some on the verge of panic, maintained complete silence for hours while ghostly voices conversed in the darkness around them. The voices continued intermittently until about 4 in the morning. Then they ceased, and the unnatural silence descended again. There were no animal sounds, no wind, not even the murmur of the nearby stream seemed to reach the camp. It was as if they had been placed under a glass dome, isolated from the natural world. When the grey light of pre-dawn finally began to illuminate the eastern sky, it was greeted with almost religious relief. Some men whispered prayers of thanksgiving. Reverend Pike, who had remained surprisingly calm throughout the ordeal, led a brief morning prayer, his deep voice breaking the silence of the night, with words of divine protection and deliverance from evil. Briggs wasted no time. He ordered them to break camp quickly, keeping only the essentials. They would leave behind tents, a few supplies, anything that would slow them down. Speed was their priority. They needed to cover as much ground as possible during daylight hours. They set out when the sun still touched only the highest peaks of the surrounding mountains. The formation was cramped, almost claustrophobic, but no one complained. Each man wanted to feel the physical presence of his companions, the tactile confirmation that he was not alone. The return journey followed the Appalachian Creek downstream, retracing the route Brennan and his 5 original survivors had taken. The terrain was familiar now, and that offered little comfort. They knew the landmarks, knew approximately how long it would take to reach each landmark on their journey back to civilization. Throughout the morning, they maintained a brisk pace. They stopped only briefly for water, never for more than 5 minutes. They ate as they walked, dried meat and stale bread from their pockets. There was no casual conversation. The men conserved their energy, focused entirely on putting distance between themselves and that damned forest. It was around noon that the first incident occurred. One of the men in the formation, a trader named David Fletcher, suddenly stopped walking. The men immediately behind him nearly collided, sending a ripple of confusion through the formation. Briggs shouted, asking what had happened. Fletcher stood completely still, staring to the left, toward the dense vegetation that sloped away from the stream. When questioned, he said in a monotone voice that he had seen his wife. She was there, among the trees, wearing the blue dress he had bought her for her last birthday. She waved at him, smiling, inviting him to come closer. The men around Fletcher looked in the direction he indicated. They saw nothing but logs and foliage. Hartley approached quickly, placing his hand on Fletcher's shoulder, speaking calmly and firmly. He explained that there was no one there, that Fletcher was exhausted and seeing things that weren't there. Fletcher's wife was home safe, awaiting his return. Fletcher blinked as if waking from a trance. He looked around in confusion, then began to tremble. Tears streamed down his face as he mumbled apologies. Hartley and another man held him by the arms, helping him continue walking. The doctor kept Fletcher close for the rest of the day, watching for signs of another episode. But it wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout the afternoon, 3 other men reported seeing things no one else saw. One saw his son, killed during the Civil War, standing in a clearing, wearing his blood-stained Confederate uniform. Another saw his mother, who had died 10 years earlier, waving from afar. A third saw what he described as a woman with long hair and a white dress, standing on the opposite bank of the creek, watching the group pass by. In each case, the men around saw nothing, and in each case the person seeing the apparition had to be physically restrained or guided away, as if being pulled by an invisible force toward the vision. Briggs recognized the pattern. The forest was trying to separate them, using the same method it had likely used on the original groups. It identified emotional weaknesses, exploited longing and loss, and created personalized illusions to lure individuals away from the safety of the group. It was a sophisticated hunting strategy, almost intelligent in its application. He ordered a system of tethers implemented. Each man would be literally tethered to the man in front and behind him, using ropes approximately 6 feet long. It would be uncomfortable. It would slow down the march, but it would ensure that no one could stray without the others immediately noticing. Implementing the tether system took a precious 20 minutes, but it proved necessary. Twice during the rest of the afternoon, men attempted to stray from the formation, pulled by visions only they could see. In both cases, the ropes kept them connected to the group, and alert companions managed to bring them back to reality. The sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains when they reached a landmark Brennan recognized, a rock formation jutting out over the stream, creating a small waterfall about 10 feet high. They had passed this place on their original journey, and Brennan estimated they were now about a day and a half's march from Augustus Cole's farm. It was a manageable distance, especially considering they knew the route and wouldn't need to explore. Briggs gathered the men for a critical decision. They could try to continue marching after dark, using torches and the light of the crescent moon to illuminate the way. It would be risky. The uneven terrain made falls and twists inevitable, but it would bring them significantly closer to safety. Alternatively, they could camp here and leave at the first sign of light. The vote was surprisingly split. Half the men wanted to continue, desperate to escape the forest as quickly as possible. The other half argued that marching in the dark would be suicidal, that serious injuries were virtually guaranteed, and that a man with a broken ankle would become a burden that would slow everyone down. Hartley offered a compromise. They would camp for a few hours, allowing everyone to rest and eat adequately. Then they would set out approximately 3 hours before dawn, using the last hours of darkness with extreme caution and quickening their pace as light arrived. This way, they would minimize vulnerable time camped without risking the safety of a night march through unfamiliar terrain. Briggs agreed to Hartley's proposal. They set up camp near the waterfall, using the rock formation as protection for one flank. Fires were lit generously, creating a semicircle of light. The men's bonds were maintained, though longer ropes allowed for limited movement. The meal that night was somber. The men ate mechanically with no real appetite, simply fulfilling the need to maintain physical strength. Some low-voiced conversations occurred, but nothing substantial. Everyone was exhausted beyond physical fatigue, carrying the mental weight of days under constant strain. Around 8 o'clock that night, while some men tried to sleep and others kept vigil, Patrick O'Brien, the lumberjack who had reported seeing a human figure the day before, suddenly began speaking. Not to his companions, but as if responding to someone unseen. His voice was strangely monotonous, devoid of natural emotion. He talked about his family in Ireland, about the famine that had forced his emigration 20 years earlier, about brothers and sisters he hadn't seen since. He described them in vivid detail, as if he were seeing them at that very moment. Then he began to rise, still bound but pulling on the rope with increasing force. The men connected to O'Brien reacted immediately, grabbing the ropes and pulling him back. O'Brien struggled with surprising strength, his expression blank, but his muscles tense with fierce determination. It took 4 men to restrain him, forcing him back to the ground and holding him there as he continued mumbling about seeing his family. Hartley examined O'Brien quickly. His pupils were dilated, his breathing rapid but shallow, and he seemed genuinely unaware of where he was. It was as if his mind had been temporarily hijacked, disconnected from the reality around him. The doctor had no suitable sedatives, only some basic tinctures he carried. He made O'Brien drink water mixed with a small amount of laudanum, enough to calm him without inducing a deep sleep. Gradually, O'Brien came to himself. He blinked, looked around in confusion, and then began to cry silently. He couldn't explain what had happened, only that for a few minutes he was absolutely certain his family was there, waiting for him in the darkness, and that all he had to do was step into the circle of light and join them. The incident established a new protocol. No one would be allowed to get up without at least 2 other men being alerted and giving permission. Watch shifts were doubled, with guards now monitoring not only the outer perimeter, but also their own companions, alert for signs of altered behavior. The hours until departure dragged by. Few slept. Those who tried found only shallow sleep, interrupted by nightmares or sudden jolts. Reverend Pike spent much of the night reciting scripture passages in a low voice, not so much preaching as offering familiar words as an anchor to reality. Exactly 3 hours before dawn, as planned, Briggs ordered everyone to rise and prepare to move. There was no breaking camp, because they had only minimally set up. They simply extinguished the fires, checked the bonds between the men, and began the march in the darkness. The crescent moon offered enough light to make out the path along the stream. They moved slowly, each step deliberate and measured before committing full weight. Falls still occurred occasionally, but the restraints prevented them from being severe. A man would stumble, be immediately caught by the men connected in front and behind, regain his balance, and continue. The 3-hour march in the darkness was tense, but uneventful. As the dawn light began to brighten the sky, it was as if an invisible weight was lifted from each man's shoulders. Visibility improved rapidly, allowing them to pick up the pace significantly. Around noon they spotted smoke in the distance. It was the chimney of Augustus Cole's farm. Several men began to weep openly at the sight of this sign of civilization. They had made it. They were out of the forest, back in familiar territory, survivors of an ordeal that had consumed 14 men and nearly taken them too. Cole was in the pasture when he saw the group emerge from the tree line. He immediately dropped his tools and ran to meet them, his wife Martha following close behind. The look of relief on Cole's face when he counted 22 men was visible even from a distance. He had feared that the rescue party would suffer the same fate as those they were searching for. The Cole family welcomed the men with every possible hospitality. Martha prepared a hot meal. Augustus offered the barn as temporary accommodation, and they provided water for everyone to wash properly. The men remained at the farm for a full day, regaining strength before continuing their final journey to the county seat. During that day of rest, Briggs wrote a detailed report of everything they had found. Hartley contributed medical observations on the mental states of the men who had experienced visions. Whitehawk drew maps, showing the exact locations of the abandoned camp and the clearing with the circular structure. The physical evidence collected was catalogued and carefully packaged. Cole shared more stories about that region of the mountains. He mentioned that over the past 50 years, since his family began working the land, they had heard occasional reports of disappearances. Never large groups like these, but rather individuals or pairs of hunters who entered the upper valleys and never returned. Local communities had learned to avoid certain areas, knowledge passed down through generations more as superstition than as formal mapping of dangerous territories. When the group finally left Cole's farm and headed for the Sullivan County seat, they were men transformed, not just by physical exhaustion, but by something deeper. There was a stillness in each of their eyes, the look of someone who had witnessed something that defied rational explanation, and knew they would carry those memories with them for the rest of their days. Sheriff Briggs submitted his full report to county authorities on October 30th, 1884. The document was 43 handwritten pages long, detailing every aspect of the rescue expedition, every disturbing discovery, every unexplained incident. The physical evidence was catalogued and stored in the county archives: human bone fragments, pieces of tissue identified as belonging to members of the original group, wood samples showing the markings on the trees, and the daguerreotype portrait of Moses Freeman with his family. The authorities' reaction was mixed. Some demanded immediate action, a massive military expedition to investigate the clearing and search for possible survivors. Others were skeptical, suggesting that exhausted and terrified men had exaggerated or misinterpreted natural events. A representative of the territorial government argued that mobilizing significant resources based on reports of voices in the forest and visions was unjustifiable. Eventually, they reached a compromise. A small expedition would be organized the following spring, when the weather was more favorable and adequate time could be devoted to a thorough investigation. It would be led by federal officers with experience in indigenous territories and would include men specifically trained to deal with hostile situations. Briggs would be invited as a consultant, but the operation would be under federal command. Samuel Brennan never returned to those mountains. The experienced guide who had led dozens of expeditions without ever losing a man now carried the weight of 14 disappearances on his conscience. He moved west, settling in a small town in Missouri where no one knew his story. According to later records, he died in 1892, never having spoken publicly about the events of 1884. Jonathan Hartley, the physician who kept the detailed diary, continued practicing medicine in rural Appalachian communities for another 15 years. His diary, kept secret throughout his life, was only discovered after his death in 1901. His family found the notebook stored in a locked trunk, along with a letter instructing them to donate them to the county historical library. The diary has become a crucial document for historians trying to understand the events of that fateful autumn. The other survivors of the rescue expeditions scattered, returning to their former lives but bearing invisible scars. Several developed what doctors of the time called nervous melancholia, waking screaming in the middle of the night, unable to enter dense forests without experiencing profound panic. Some became fervently religious, finding solace in spiritual interpretations of what they had experienced. Others simply refused to discuss the matter, maintaining absolute silence even when questioned directly by curious family members. The federal expedition promised for the spring of 1885 was repeatedly postponed, first due to budgetary issues, then due to administrative changes in the government, and finally due to a lack of political will. The disappearances had occurred in remote territory, far from significant population centers. The victims were ordinary men without significant political connections. The case simply lost priority among dozens of other issues competing for government attention and resources. In 1887, 3 years after the events, a small private expedition was organized by family members of some of the missing men. They hired local guides and followed maps left by Whitehawk, attempting to reach the clearing with the circular structure. They never found it. They traveled the upper valleys of Appalachian Creek for 2 weeks, but the tree markings that should have guided them were simply gone. It was as if the forest itself had erased the evidence, reabsorbing its secrets. Edgar Whitmore's tavern, where it all began, continued to operate for another 10 years, but the story of the 21 hunters who left and only 7 who returned haunted the establishment. Travelers avoided staying there, claiming to hear strange sounds during the night. Whitmore himself began drinking heavily, talking to himself about responsibilities and decisions he should never have allowed. He closed the tavern in 1894, exactly 10 years after the disappearances, and moved to live with a daughter in another state. Official Sullivan County records list 14 men as missing, presumed dead, in October of 1884. Their names are catalogued in dusty documents stored in the historical archives: Thomas Webb, Henry Dalton, the 3 Cunningham brothers, Moses Freeman, and 8 others, whose names gradually faded from collective memory as the decades passed, and those who knew them died. There are no graves for these men. There are no monuments. Their families held memorial services, prayed for their souls, and eventually moved on, because there was no alternative. Some wives remarried after the appropriate period of mourning. Children grew up without fathers, carrying only fragmented stories of men who went into the mountains in search of game and never returned. The forest remains. The Appalachian Creek still winds through those ancient valleys, its cold waters flowing over stones polished by millennia of erosion. The trees that witnessed the events of 1884 have aged, some have fallen, and new ones have grown in their place. The natural cycle continues, oblivious to the small human tragedies that occasionally disrupt its eternal flow. Local communities still tell stories about those upper valleys. Names have changed over generations, details have been distorted by repetition, but the essence remains. There are places in the mountains where people shouldn't go, trails that shouldn't be followed, voices in the forest that should never be answered. It's knowledge passed down not through official maps or government notices, but through whispers between neighbors, warnings from grandparents to grandchildren, lessons learned through blood and terror. Occasionally, even today, more than a century later, hunters or hikers report strange experiences in those regions. Voices that imitate loved ones, visions of people who shouldn't be there, the inescapable feeling of being watched by something that remains forever just beyond their vision. Most dismiss it as an overactive imagination, the effects of loneliness and exhaustion. Some know the old stories and leave quickly, refusing to tempt their fate. 7 men left that forest in 1884. 22 left on the second attempt. How many entered and never left over the centuries before and after remains unknown. The forest keeps no records, offers no explanations, and does not negotiate with those who violate its deepest domains. 21 hunters followed Appalachian Creek in 1884. Only 7 left. The other 14 remain there in one form or another, now part of the shadows among the trees, echoes in the silent valleys, unheard warnings to those who would come after. Their stories ended in that ancient forest, but the mystery of what truly happened remains unsolved, guarded by mountains that keep secrets better than any human vault. And if you hear voices in the forest that sound like people you know, don't respond. Don't follow. Stay in the light, stay with your group, and leave as quickly as possible, because some trails once followed offer no return. If this story intrigued you about the dark mysteries hidden within history, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next disturbing stories we'll reveal. Like us if you've reached the end of this journey with us, and tell us in the comments, would you dare explore a forest with stories like this? Your interaction helps more people discover these fascinating and terrifying cases that time has almost erased.